bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the April 1st, 2025 episode. My guests for this week's episode are Peter Lawrence and Rich Larsen. Now, if this duo seems familiar, it's because they were also guests for our January 28th episode. And that episode, by the way, has become the most popular episode in Tax Credit Tuesday history in a relatively short period of time. During that episode, Peter and Rich discussed the possible effects of the Trump administration on the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as on public housing authorities. Now, a lot has happened in the last 10 weeks since President Trump took office. And because of that, and given the popularity of the January 28th episode, we thought it was a good time to revisit this very important topic. I also want to note that April 1 is the day targeted for HUD to release the new tax credit income limits, and those income limits derivatively provide the rent limits for long-term tax credit in many bond finance and other properties. Now, we're recording today's podcast on Monday, March 31st. And so far, there's been no announcement made with respect to meeting the April 1st deadline. I will have Thomas Stagg, partner in Novogradac, who is the leading expert on all things HUD income limit related. I'll have him on as a guest to discuss the implications of income limits when they're released. Now, turning back to today's podcast, let me remind you who our guests are. Peter is Novogradac's Chief Public Policy Officer, and he works out of our Washington, D.C. office. I'm pleased to also note that Peter has been promoted last month, to that Chief Public Policy Officer role. And anyone who has worked with him or listened to him or watched him on this podcast before knows that was a promotion that was very well deserved. Peter's an expert on a variety of community development tax incentives. I'd even go so far as to say on every community development tax incentive, as well as affordable housing initiatives. And as one of his many roles at Novogradac, he provides monthly updates to the various Novogradac working groups. And I would encourage our listeners and other members of our audience to join the various working groups that might apply to your areas of focus. Turning to Rich. Rich is our leading in-house expert on public housing authorities. Rich is based in our Toms River, New Jersey office. And more importantly, Rich works extensively with public housing authorities as their auditor and much, much more, which means he has a unique perspective on what's happening to PHAs, as well as how PHAs are reacting to what's happening in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. So today we're going to talk about what we've learned from recent budget and spending proposals, as well as enacted legislation. More specifically, we'll talk about the full 2025 fiscal year continuing resolution that was passed last month. And we'll also talk about what we're hearing about the upcoming release of President Trump's fiscal year 2026 budget request. We also will touch upon proposed staffing changes at HUD, as well as the administration's freezing of $1 billion in green and resilient retrofit funding. Obviously, we have a lot that we want to discuss with you today. So if you're ready, let's get started. Peter and Rich, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thank you, Mike. And I hope that perhaps I actually should hope for that OMB is going to make some announcement today that will get us to break our record from January.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Mike. It's very good to be back. Yes.
So before we jump into our discussion, I'd like for each of you to discuss the various services you provide to Novogradac clients. And we can start with you, Peter.
So, Mike, in addition to focusing on what's happening in Congress and the administration in our practice areas of affordable housing, community development, historic preservation, and clean energy, we also do a variety of public health policy engagements with clients. If you have something you want to develop a proposal, engage with on a particular challenge you have with a program or initiative, we're more than happy to engage with you and help find solutions to those problems. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, Mike, I do spend a lot of time also with clients in our various working groups. And relevant for this one, of course, is our local housing tax credit working group, as well as our income limits working group. And if you are interested in any of those, please feel free to contact.
Thank you, Peter. Rich?
All right, sure. I am the lead partner in the firm's Public Housing Authority auditing practice. Novogradac provides annual audit services to approximately 85 PHAs across the country. And we also provide various consulting services on numerous HUD programs, such as the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program and the Moving to Work Program. That about covers it, Mike.
Great. Thank you, Rich. So let's jump right in to funding of the federal government. We did get funding this month through September 30th of 2025, the fiscal year end of the United States government. And it was done through a continuing resolution. So Peter, please share how the funding fared in the continuing resolution. And maybe we heard about anomalies. Maybe you could discuss what it means to have an anomaly associated with a continuing resolution.
Sure thing, Mike. So it is unusual to have a full year continuing resolution. Typically, continuing resolutions are things that Congress passes to buy some time for them to formulate a full year new spending bill. But they were not able to do that. And I think in the end, given all these various other priorities they have, they just decided to take a somewhat simplistic route and just extend that continuing resolution for the entire fiscal year through September 30th. And often is the case, including those temporary continuing resolutions, they have what are called anomalies. And those are exceptions to the sort of general rule whereby the federal agencies are allowed to spend at their annual daily rate based on what they receive in appropriations the previous fiscal year. And it is often very common to have some anomalies because programs don't always neatly have spending needs throughout the fiscal year at the same amounts. So Congress will often program these things in. But this particular fiscal year, full year continuing resolution did have quite a bit larger anomalies than normal. And so let me highlight a few of those within HUD. Housing choice vouchers received a total of $36 billion for renewals. That is a $3.66 billion or 11.3% increase from the previous fiscal year. It's not 100% clear whether that's enough to fully fund all vouchers in use, not only because there are increased costs of rental, but also because as families return vouchers, that also affects the need for PHAs for renewal funding. So it may be that PHAs may not be able to put out every single voucher that's returned. We'll just have to see how the funding plays out there. It would be surprising if the PHAs end the fiscal year with not the same amount of vouchers in use as a result. The project-based rental assistance account, which is essentially HUD's contracts with owners of privately owned HUD-assisted housing, received $16.9 billion, which is $880 million or 5.5% more. And that, according to all reports we have heard, seems likely to be sufficient to provide a full months of renewal funding for all the contracts that are scheduled to expire between March 14th and September 30th. So we'll see. I think that will be the case amount. And then the two other housing anomalies, a little bit more minor ones, but anomalies nonetheless. The Section 202 Housing for the Elderly program received $931 million, which is an $18 million or 2% increase. And the Section 811 Housing for People with Disabilities received $257 million, which is 49 or 23% more than fiscal year 2024. Although I will note that's what they received in 2023, so it's not as dramatic as an increase as it may seem. But I think it is worth noting that as our overall, non-defense discretionary spending decrease overall by $13 billion. A lot of that was due to earmarks, which are the congressionally determined spending, of which HUD had quite a bit. And given the nature of it being a continuing resolution and not a regular annual spending bill, those earmarks were taken out. So I think it's a challenge for some members of Congress that were hoping to be able to have those projects funded in their district, but we'll see what happens for the next fiscal year.
Right. Thank you for that, Peter. And I have lots of questions about the implications of the city resolution through September 30th of 2025 impacts on next year's funding levels. But before we start focusing on the year after this year, Rich, what are some of the implications of the city resolution extension for public housing authorities?
Okay, sure, Mike. I think we have to elaborate a little bit on the funding levels that Peter touched on, because as he mentioned, costs have really increased for PHAs over the last several years. Rents, insurance, salaries, construction materials have far outpaced previous year's funding increases. So when we talk about level funding or modest increases in funding, although that doesn't sound bad, it doesn't really meet the needs of most PHAs because of those increases in costs. And
Just to insert here that under the continuing resolution for public housing authorities, the operating funding and the capital funding ended up being the same as the year before.
right.
Voting.
Exactly. And that will cause some hardship. Peter mentioned Section 8 funding also. It's estimated that maybe 32,000 households may lose vouchers across the country. And how that works out, for example, I don't want to talk like an accountant, but if a unit was getting $1,000 and now fair market rent's 1,100, the PHA has to make up that $100 difference. Now the PHA can negotiate with the landlord. They can fund the difference out of reserves, or they can drop the voucher. And so that's really what a PHA is looking at. That's the implication of an increase in contract rent. And we just talked about level funding for capital programs. Right now, PHAs have probably about a $70 billion capital backlog. Now, when we talk about these units, these are the units that the housing authorities own, part of the public housing program. So level funding is only going to exacerbate this situation. Probably most PHAs are going to defer maintenance on capital programs, defer routine maintenance if they can, maybe scale back tenant services. But I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, because there is some optimism out there with some PHAs. PHAs are optimistic that funding cuts will bring some deregulation to HUD programs. The cost of complying with HUD program regulations is a huge burden for PHAs. So if funding reductions can come with a reduced compliance burden, well, that may be a lot easier for PHAs to absorb that reduced funding, because there'll be a lot of reduced costs on their end. So for example, if HUD will reduce reporting requirements for some programs, reduce the frequency of income verification or unit inspections, or even something as simple as making program funds fungible from one program to another. Because we know that if you have a surplus in one federal program, say a voucher program, a Section 8 program, you can't use those funds to supplement another federal program. It has to stay in that program. So things like that can make a huge difference in a PHA's bottom line. And I think that's really what PHAs are hoping for comes out of the Trump administration. Deregulation that'll really reduce their overhead burden.
So, Rich, that's all interesting. One of the things that I find particularly interesting is the estimate that the Housing Choice Voucher Program will be reduced by 32,000 households. And the reason why I say that is, as Peter noted, Housing Choice Vouchers received a 11% increase in fiscal year 2025 over 2024. And that 11% increase appears not to be enough to allow the existing number of vouchers to be maintained.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And the Northeast, California, where you're at, the rent increases were significantly higher.
And it just goes to show, it really illustrates what Peter and I and you have talked about in the past, which is the rise of the cost of housing is a supply problem. And housing choice vouchers aren't the demand subsidy that housing choice vouchers provides, isn't providing enough of an incentive to increase supply.
And Mike, I think also it's just worth pointing out is that the voucher rural funding is often a lagging indicator. Some people may be thinking, well, if I look at the rental markets with all these new market rate supply, does that mean the rents overall are moderating? Well, all the run ups in the pandemic has happened in a delayed time frame for HUD funding reasons. So we're still in the context of all those really rapid rent increases that we saw during the pandemic and the years shortly thereafter. So I think that's the effects of the broader market rate supply haven't yet really impacted the types of housing vouchers help with the rent.
No, thank you for that. And it just plays into the fact that what you could rent a unit for today isn't necessarily what you could rent it for 6 months ago or a year ago or longer ago than that, given all the various sort of delays. That's a very good point in terms of how it takes a while for it to flow through the system. So let's turn now to fiscal year 2026. And the next step is for Trump to release a budget, a broader budget for the federal government. And obviously, as part of that, there'll be a budget for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So, Peter, please share with our audience where we are right now with respect to the budget requests that President Trump will be releasing in stages in the coming month plus.
So, Mike, of course, according to the usual schedule, we would have had the budget request the first Monday in February, and that definitely doesn't happen. It usually doesn't happen the first year of an administration, but it particularly was delayed given that as we just were discussing, finally finished fiscal year 2025. But we've heard that we are expecting, as you noted, a budget request release in stages. Sometime this month, we expect the administration to release what is often referred to as a budget blueprint, which isn't the full, large, detailed budget request, but the high level details, what each agency is going to get and some select programs to help form the budgeting process for Congress so they can get started on their process in the budget appropriations. And then sometime we understand in May, the Trump administration is expected to do the full budget request. So by the time that appropriations committees are in the really thick of helping draft those bills, they'll have those details to work off. It's not clear, by the way, for those of you who may be looking for it, that the Trump administration will release a fiscal year 2026 Green Book of tax proposals, which is often a part of the whole budget request process. The first Trump administration did not do so all 4 years of their administration. So it wouldn't surprise me if they did not as part of the full budget request, but we'll see. Maybe it will, as given Congress's attention on doing a tax reconciliation bill. I will also say it's very much a cliche to say the administration's budget request is DOA in Congress, dead on arrival. But that sort of commentary happens no matter whether the White House is from the same party as the majority in Congress or not. It's often Congress and administration have different views of spending on the various programs. And administrations definitely express their priorities and their essentially their wish list in their budget requests. But I will say this year, given the administration's actions, as we talked about previously, and what's happened over the weeks, where a lot of the president's team has argued that they're not necessarily obligated to spend every single dollar that Congress has authorized. The budget request may be more meaningful this year, maybe taken a little bit more with seriousness by Congress, given that the actions of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, have fueled that perception and those fears of many folks among appropriators. So we'll have to see. I will say I am expecting a lot of the same funding and spending requests that we saw in the first administration, such as requesting no funding at all, zeroing out home community development block grants, public housing capital subsidies, the Choice Neighborhood Initiative, amongst others. But we do also expect that the administration will propose making the rental assistance demonstration or rent demonstration program a permanent program and remove the public housing unit cap and maybe perhaps some sort of modest incremental funding to help with those versions. And I will say, I think a guess would be that most HUD rental assistance programs will receive modest increases, maybe not enough again to cover all the increases in rents, but definitely will be better off than most HUD programs where I strongly expect them to be cut, maybe perhaps substantially cut. And I will say, just regarding the DOGE spending cuts, there's talk about in Congress ratifying them in what's called a rescission package, which essentially would enable Congress with a majority vote in the Senate just simply to cut previously authorized funding. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see one considered, although I just will note that, again, during the first Trump administration, there was a rescission package that came to the floor of Congress to vote on and actually failed. So it's not often as easy as it sounds. And Republicans actually had a much larger majority in the first administration than they currently do.
Brett, thank you for that, Peter. So as Peter was mentioning various aspects, Rich, I couldn't help but think,
Yeah.
so how are public housing authorities preparing for what they don't know what's going to happen nominally, but they know directionally?
Right. And that's a great question. And the good news is that PHAs have been through this before. Back in the Obama administration, there was turmoil, there was cutbacks. They went through a period of recapture where housing authorities that had built up reserves and managed their programs efficiently had their reserves recaptured and basically taken from them. There was sequestration where funding was cut across the board for PHAs. But now, 2026, I haven't seen any firm decisions about 2026, and those budgets are being prepared now. But there's basically three things that PHAs are going to have to address. And really, it's a local preference. Will they try to maintain the level of services they provide the residents? And that's not cutting vouchers, providing the family self-sufficiency programs and those support services for the residents. Can they maintain that level of service? Can they maintain the level of PHA staff? Are they going to have to do layoffs? And finally, can they maintain the quality of their public housing inventory or ensure the quality of the units that their program participants are renting? Because that's all a function of compliance. So can they inspect those units? Can they bring in the right tenants for those programs and so forth? So those are really the priorities, that the three things that each housing authority board is going to have to address. And they all make their own decisions. They're all independent bodies. HUD does not tell them what to do or how to do it. And so we always say, hey, if you want to have influence about 2026 and your next housing authority budget, go to those meetings and speak up.
So Rich, you mentioned that the Obama administration recaptured some public housing authority reserves when he was president. When you look across public housing authorities today, and as they're facing funding challenges that are even more extreme, right? They're facing or fearing cutbacks more extreme than they've seen more recently. Some will presumably have PHA reserves, others will not. How will various public housing authorities address this?
That's right, Mike. That's a great question again. Some PHAs are much more healthy than other PHAs. And obviously, the ones that are healthy have a lot more options. They will be able to absorb the cuts with minimal disruption to services. For the last 15 years or so, we've been advising our clients to diversify their housing portfolio and their revenue stream, become less reliant on the federal government. The ones that have done that will also be able to absorb these cuts with minimal disruption. They have options. However, there are still a lot of PHAs without reserves. They're 100% dependent on federal funding. They're going to have a real hard time, and they're going to face more drastic cuts in reality. In the past, PHAs have had available shortfall funding. So when they do hit a shortfall, when voucher program funds are not going to meet the needs of the contract rents, they've been able to call on HUD for shortfall funding, it's called. I don't know how much and if that will be available in 2026. Housing authorities do not know that. So that's a real uncertainty. And it's not like a housing authority can refinance their mortgage and get cash. They have to have liquidity. They have to have the ability to pay bills as they become due. And so 2026 could be a real trying time for housing authorities, especially the ones that haven't converted to RAD, that haven't diversified their housing portfolio.
And I do want to just note, you mentioned that PHAs with large reserves can absorb the cuts with minimal disruption. I just wanted to add, it's really minimal short-term disruption.
Yeah.
Over the longer term, based upon planned uses for those reserves and the rest, it obviously will cause disruption. But you mentioned the RAD program. How is the fact that we now have this continuing resolution through the end of the 2025 fiscal year, and we'll shortly see a budget for 2026, but it seems like funding will be challenging. How's that affected the level of interest that public housing authorities have in the RAD program?
Well, I will say this as someone who's heavily involved in the RAD program. We've had dozens of clients we've assisted in converting their public housing units through the RAD program. I will tell you, those housing authorities that got out of the public housing program are feeling a lot less pressure right now than those that are still in it. And I think my experience and over the last 60 days, or actually probably since the election, I've probably presented 20 or 25 audit reports to boards. And that is the question, is the ones that haven't converted to RAD, how can we get in the program? Is it too late? And how will that help us? And my experience is most PHAs would utilize the RAD program right now if they can make it work financially. The problem is we have the rising construction costs, rising insurance costs. Our interest rates are higher than they were a few years ago. So that has all impacted those deals. And can those deals pencil out? No, pencil out, as the developer would say, can we make them work financially? And housing authorities actually have procrastinated the last several years because public housing subsidies were very good. And so now the cycle's turning back around. The subsidies aren't going to be so good the next several years. So now they're asking, hey, we got to convert through the RAD program. If housing authorities can get the public housing units and the RAD project to become financially feasible, where the rents work, I think an overwhelming amount of PHAs would convert. There still is a ton of interest in the program.
So thank you, Rich. So Peter, some of our members of our audience may be thinking, I've buried the lead by waiting until now to ask this question. That we've been reading in the news and accessing through other sources that we have at Novogradac that there are steep cuts coming, and already been some, to HUD staffing. And also, in addition to overall HUD staffing cuts, also regional offices, field offices being closed. So what can you share that's known right now with respect to staffing reductions at HUD, as well as regional or field offices being closed?
Happy to do so, Mike, although it's not happy news. As you mentioned, a variety of media outlets have all widely reported that HUD has plans to reduce HUD staffing potentially as high as 50%. And this is being done in conjunction with the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. And they're been spreading like wildfire here in Washington, D.C., the specific division by division cuts, where as some divisions like the Office of Community Planning and Development, which handles home and community development block grants and homeless funding, et cetera. That staffing is proposed to be cut as much as 84%. Be quite a drastic reduction in staffing. Although, again, as you point out, we don't have confirmation that these are actually been executed yet. Similarly, there's been a variety of media reports about HUD field offices that are proposed to be closed. And in these reports, a sizable number of states would be without any HUD field office whatsoever, which, according to some, would appear to not follow the law, which we understand to say you must have at least one field office in each state to process FHA loan endorsements. So, but again, I will hasten to add all these proposals, we don't have confirmation that they have been executed. And it's not clear whether HUD is going to follow through on these media reports and execute all these various staffing closings. We have heard confirmations of some, but other field offices continue to operate. Nevertheless, I think it is widely assumed that loan processing, grant awarding, and grant disbursements and oversight will slow. You're going to cut staff, there's going to be some sort of effect. I can't imagine there'll be zero effect whatsoever. And so we're keeping our ears to ground and see how our clients might be affected. So to the extent they're using HUD funding, and we're going to continue to report on it and see what happens. It wouldn't surprise me if HUD doesn't necessarily follow through on all of them. That they are getting feedback from members of Congress. And in fact, I would say if you are concerned, reaching out to a member of Congress to make sure that they are aware of the implications of all these staffing cuts and field office closings on your ability to get financing for your projects will have an impact. So definitely that type of feedback is helpful in helping perhaps change HUD's mind on some of these plans.
Thank you for that, Peter. And I did have a conversation with one senior Republican senator who commented that having at least one field office in every state doesn't seem like excess staffing. So, Rich, with respect to these various cuts within the HUD staffing, how are the public housing authorities reacting to that potential in ways in which they see it affecting their ability to operate?
Well, first, I'll start with in talking to a lot of executive directors, I'll start with the positive. They do feel there are opportunities for HUD to be more streamlined and more efficient. And so where that'll happen, I think they'll support it. But on the other side of it, there is great concern that field office cuts are really going to impact the services they provide to tenants and program participants. And things like the implementation of new regulations and rules. You got to understand that the local field office is the primary contact for the PHA. They know the area, they know the region. Quite often, the PHAs know the HUD field office personnel by first name. They've spoke at conferences with them. They've seen them places, and they provide interpretation on new rules. They assist in funding requests. So losing a field office is a pretty big deal. It leaves that PHA without the go-to person. And as Peter mentioned, the concern is a lot of these vital functions will be drastically bottlenecked or impaired. And if you have to call a 1-800 number, it's going to be a problem. And if you're going to be on hold and you can't get an answer, it's going to impair services that housing authorities can provide to their tenants.
And I will also note to add to that, that in talking to some clients that had heard about rumored field office closures, they were probably less concerned about closures of some offices, but concerned about which ones are getting closed, in the sense that there was one that they thought worked really effectively that was going to be closed, and another one they didn't think worked very effectively that was the one that was going to be kept open.
Yeah.
They were like, if you're going to start closing them, at least get some feedback from users,
Right.
which offices are performing better than others. I can't help when I think about staffing cuts and the simplification of the regulatory burden and the rest. I can't help but think of the book that I'm reading right now, Abundance, that's co-authored by Ezra Klein, which talks a lot about the importance of innovation and building the housing crisis and the regulatory burden that's challenging the ability of government to facilitate solutions. But I won't go into that. Maybe I'll have you both back for a book review. Let's move on to the other subject matter that I foreshadowed at the beginning of the introduction. And that has to do with the Green and Resilient Retrofit program funding. And that was roughly $1 billion. And the public media has been reporting it being frozen. And obviously we have clients that aren't getting the funding that they were committed to get. So Peter, what can you say about the current status of the Green and Resilient Retrofit program funding? And maybe say a little bit about what it is.
Yes.
And then where we are right now, any thoughts you have as to where we're headed?
Absolutely. So two levels set, Mike. The Green and Resilient Retrofit program is a program that was authorized by the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed in the last Congress and the Biden administration. And it provided a little less than $1 billion in grant funding with loan authority up to $4 billion. And it's going to privately own HUD-assisted housing, like project-based rental assistance, like Section 202 housing for the elderly, Section 811 housing for people with disabilities, et cetera, and so forth. And Congress authorized this funding, and HUD, in 3 sort of basic buckets or cohorts, had awarded all of this funding. And the 3 cohorts, just to remind folks, there was the elements, which is the lightest touch of the 3 cohorts and was the fastest to deploy of all of them. There's the leading edge, which is an intermediate category, which was designed to really be fit well with the low-income housing tax credit. And that is the median range of rehab needs. And then there was the comprehensive, which was really designed to do the deepest retrofits for the broadest ability for resilience and then the highest sort of rehab needs. But even though all of these 3 cohorts and all the funding was award announcements do not mean that they were officially obligated or legally committed to a specific property. So HUD would make an announcement, but then the awardee would work with a variety of, with a lender, with potentially an investor, if they're doing a housing credit property, to arrange all the financing and then have it closed. And only at closing would HUD have that legal obligation. And so some of the early awards, especially those first 2, the elements and leading edge cohorts, they obligated their funding because they were closed before January 20th. But I would say many awards, including some elements and leading edge and a lot of the comprehensive awards, had not been obligated because they haven't been a part of a closing. And those are the funds that have been frozen by the new HUD leadership at HUD. It's not 100% clear what will happen. Anecdotally, I hear from some awardees that it is likely that any unobligated comprehensive awards are probably going to be canceled at some point in the future. But it's also possible that, and again, anecdotally, we hear that some elements of leading edge awards that haven't been obligated, but have members of Congress fighting for them and advocating in HUD, that they will eventually be allowed to get to closing and be obligated. So I want to encourage folks, if you have an award, please reach out to a member of Congress to try to see if they can get it unfrozen. It's not completely without hope. I think there is still a chance that it might be unlocked, but you're going to have to fight for it.
So thank you for that, Peter. I now want to start to bring this to a close, but I'm going to bring it to a close with a very broad question. And I would encourage our listeners to email cpas@nofico.com with any additional questions you think that you'd like to ask Peter or Rich. And maybe we'll come up with a different way to share some of those answers in advance of Peter and Rich coming back. But Rich, let me start with you and say, what do we know now that we didn't know 10 weeks ago? And I'll actually also ask you, when do you think you and Peter should be coming back on the podcast based on what we know now?
Well,
Go ahead.
Yeah. I got to say, what I know now is Peter's job is a lot harder than mine, being a director of public policy. Keeping track of this federal budget and the rumors surrounding it. My head has been spinning for 10 weeks just trying to keep my clients informed. But thank goodness that I do have Peter informing me so I can bring that information out to our clients. But you know what I've been telling my public housing authorities, what we're talking about in meetings is, you know what, we do have a continuing resolution now. It is law. It contains real funding numbers, and PHAs need to be proactive. They can't assume that there's going to be shortfall funding, that something's going to bail them out. Or they need to be proactive. They need to adjust their program budgets accordingly. And the most important part there is they need to maintain liquidity in each of their federal programs and be able to pay those bills as they become due. There may be administrative cutbacks. They may have to reduce the size of programs, reduce tenant services. They need to be proactive. They can't sit on their hands. They can't wait for something else to happen. You need to assume that 2026 is not going to be any better than 2025, and they need to adjust accordingly.
Thank you for that, Rich. So, Peter, what do we know now that we didn't know 10 weeks ago?
Well, it's been quite an eventful 10 weeks. Like, I had to say, I've been in DC for just about 25 years. And it's this first 10 weeks of administration has been unlike any what I've ever experienced. So it's been quite a roller coaster. Clearly, we do know that there's been a lot of change in how DC and the federal government operates. But I will say we don't know what's the end of the story yet. I think that's one takeaway is there's a lot of disruption. A lot of things will be changing, but we're still in the middle of it. And I think as more and more members of the administration, they have confirmations that the political appointees get staffed out and they get their sea legs. I think maybe it'll look differently than it does now, Mike, and we'll have a new normal there. Folks will begin wrapping their heads around and how HUD will be operating, how the federal government will be operating. So I wish I could give a little bit more clarity on this, but as we're in the sort of the middle of the trip, and it's the horizon is still unfocused at the moment. And I think maybe, let's say, once we get to August, we'll get a better sense of how things will, as we reach the end of this fiscal year, we'll be getting next fiscal year, we'll get a better sense of how things will really be operating like differently.
Now, when I think about the timing of having both of you back, I think the president's budget will come out. And as you've noted, it's going to be well from Tesla. You noted that that with respect to the budget coming out, that we'll know something in a fuller budget, maybe 45 days plus or minus. And I would think that it's going to be, I like to think of it as the low water mark, right? In the sense that it's whatever it is, once something gets approved through the House and the Senate, it'll be better than that. But I also look at it and say, Congress is in the midst of dealing with trying to pass a big, beautiful bill and deal with the debt limit as part of that and extend the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So it'll take up a lot of oxygen in the room, as they say, possibly all the way until July, maybe not, but possibly all the way until July. So when I'm thinking of the funding of the federal government for the next year, how much news will be breaking beyond the president's budget, do you think, Peter, between now and dealing with this big, beautiful bill?
There's potentially a lot of news, right? A lot of things can be changed. And so we'll just have to see. I do think that there are going to be some positive, as we're just been helpfully pointing out through all his answers. And there's going to be some new challenges. PHAs will have to, and other HUD program participants are going to have to get used to. So I definitely think that things won't be the same the way they used to be. And folks are going to need to adjust to this new reality. And it could be quite challenging, definitely, but there may be some positives out of it as well.
So thank you for that. Before we do wrap up, anything else our listeners should know? I'll maybe start with you, Rich, and then let Peter share anything else he wants to make sure our listeners know before we move on to bring this podcast to a close?
Sure. Sometimes, Mike, we're talking big picture. We're talking Washington, the federal budget, and HUD, and that's a little abstract for a lot of people. But they really should know each public housing authority is an independent entity, and it's governed locally by a board of commissioners that's appointed by their local governing body, the mayor and council. And so any response that a PHA may have to a financial crisis or cutbacks really can be influenced by the stakeholders, by the residents of that community. And I just urge people to get involved. If you want to see your housing authority move in a certain direction that's positive for your community, go to a meeting and make your voice heard, get on the board. And that's really the way to make a difference. And as I mentioned, PHAs have the flexibility or have options to handle a crisis however they want to handle it, given their financial
Right.
resources and given their standing.
I do like that point, Rich, because sometimes on this podcast, we can end up talking a lot about public housing authorities and federal funding as if that's the extent of it. And that's like the relation. Public housing authorities look only to the federal government for funding. Obviously, we talk about RAD, which is a way of public housing authorities indirectly tapping into a lot of the tax credits and other sources of housing funding. But when we were preparing for the podcast, you were noting that any shortfalls coming from HUD could be made up through a local affordable housing fund, through state subsidies, finding other sources of revenue within the housing authority, and just basically having to be a little bit more anti-fragile, a little more robust in their funding sources, a little bit more diversified.
Thanks for bringing that back up, Mike. That's correct.
No,
Yep.
thank you for bringing it to the housing authority as an independent entity that has other opportunities beyond getting funding from the federal government.
That's right.
Peter, what closing comments would you have?
Yeah, so I feel duty bound as someone who focuses on federal government advocacy. You should make sure that you engage with your member of Congress. Perhaps often one of the best ways to do it is to invite them to your property that you manage, so they see the residents that you're serving and how the federal funds are being deployed in their community, and how, if they're going through a RAD conversion, how federal funding is important for that as well. And that when federal government officials and members of Congress see what you're doing, they're much more likely to support it. And I know sometimes it can be a challenge getting a member of Congress to visit a property because they're in DC and they're got a really, housing is not the only thing they focus on. There's all these various other important issues that they focus on, but they have occasionally district work periods. There's one coming up in a couple of weeks for Easter, and that's often a great time to invite them. They'll be in the district, in the home state for an extended period of time. Come show them what you're doing with your portfolio, what you're doing, what the services you're providing their constituents. And you'll find, I've never heard of a time when a member of Congress has come and visited and they've turned against
Right.
that you're demonstrating. So advocacy works even with a wide variety of political perspectives. And so I want to encourage folks to do that.
I also appreciate you encouraging advocacy. You and I have been in a number of meetings with members of Congress where, in the face of these various furloughs and staffing reductions across government, not just within the discussion around HUD, where members of Congress are hearing from their constituents about a certain person losing their job or a certain service that can no longer be provided, and then member of Congress getting engaged and getting it back up and running. Because obviously there's been some changes that it was almost like break it, then we'll fix it. Let's not make sure we don't break it. So that I could attest that in a number of situations, that level of advocacy and reaching out to members of Congress has been effective, and members of Congress have encouraged their constituents to do just that. So thank you for focusing on advocacy and importance. And it's a great kind of closing theme to not just sit back and watch, but be engaged in the process. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Rich. I will share your email addresses in today's show notes or those that want to reach out to you. Also encourage our audience to send an email to cpas@novoco.com if there are additional questions that you'd like to direct to Peter or Rich. And it may be something that you're interested in. And if you're interested in it, it's likely that there are many other members of our audience interested in it as well. Before we get to the op mic section, I do want to remind our audience to subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform or platforms you use. Also, please share the podcast with your colleagues who may be interested in learning more about what we discuss on Tax Credit Tuesday. There is a full archive of episodes available on our website at novoco.com. Now, let's turn to the op mic section. And this is a fun space where we get to give a shout out to someone working in one of the many community development and affordable housing areas that we at Novogradac focus. And we get to highlight someone who's deserving of recognition. And Lord knows there are a lot of people working in these areas that deserve recognition. So Peter, let me start with you. Who would you like to give a shout out to?
Mike, I'd like to give a shout out to Mike Gerber and Elizabeth Strojan. If you recall, on the January 28th podcast, I did call out the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities and their executive director, Cindy Zitterman, for establishing their 10-year roadmap plan and strategy session for PHAs. They really are proactively thinking much more broadly on what do we need, what do public housing authorities need to adjust to the new reality, and also to establish a more firm platform for public housing authorities over the next 10 years. And I'll just note that while they're helping convene, there are certain public housing authority leaders that are helping guide that process as well. And Mike is the executive director of the Austin, Texas PHA, and Elizabeth is the executive director of the Louisville PHA, and they're both heavily involved in leading that 10-year roadmap efforts. And Rich and I are both involved also in that effort in various capacities, and we're very happy to do so. And I want to just applaud the leadership of Mike and Elizabeth in pushing this forward.
Great. Thank you for that, Peter. I echo the efforts of Mike Gerber and Elizabeth Strojan as well. So thank you for that, and look forward to the future contributions you're going to make. Rich, who do you want to give a shout out to?
Sure, Mike, I'd like to give a shout out to Tom Furlong. Tom is the Director of Finance at the Perth Amboy Housing Authority, New Jersey. Tom is a friend of mine, and he's retiring after 3 decades of service to the public housing industry. Yes, he's been a great asset to PHAs over the years. Tom and I, we've spoken at many state housing conferences together. He even helped me get my start in public housing, referred me one of my first clients ever back in 2000, I think, the year 2000. And he will be missed, definitely be missed by me. We've had a lot of fun together over the years, and we shared a lot of clients together. So happy retirement to Tom Furlong.
Excellent. And happy retirement, Tom. So Peter and Rich, thank you for being a guest on the podcast today. Thank you for coming back so quickly after the January 28th episode. And look forward to having you back when the timing's right. And to our audience,
Absolutely.
Michael Novogradac, thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.